Thank you very much. Thank you, good evening, and welcome to the third installment of this series on surrealism in the Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series 2024. Two lectures already. The first one by Krzysztof Witulkowski on the 15th of October was about the long history of the Czech surrealist group and the role of photography was playing it. The second was on the 5th of November by Fabrice Blaventos, who spoke about Chilean artist matter and his use of soil in his works to give his paintings a political inflection. And this week we are welcoming Alice Maud, who will be speaking on the remarkable cloth sculptures of cloth and bits and pieces that she found from about 1965. And this room, I think, is just the room that's on in the Pompidou. If you go to the exhibition that's in the Pompidou now, you actually see this installation. So Alice is Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art History and very recently formerly the head of the Department of the History of Art at the University of Cambridge. She is a writer and a curator. Her main books are Surrealism and the Politics of Eros, 2005, Eroticism and Art, 2007, and the Marquis de Sade and the Avant-Garde of 2020, and many articles, too many to mention really, many articles and catalogue essays on surrealism, modernism, and contemporary art, which you can check out on the Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series web pages, if you like. Alice was the curator of Dorothea Tanning, the monographic exhibition at the Reina Sofia and Tate Modern across 2018 to 19, and Sade, Freedom or Evil in Barcelona last year. So, the format, I think some of you know this, the format is a 45 to 50-minute lecture, followed by about 15-20 minutes of questions, depending on how you feel. And then there'll be drinks in that direction in the Research Forum seminar room. So I should just mention finally, actually, that Alice's first book, I think you're going to mention this, the Eroticism, Surrealism and the Politics of Eros, was the outcome of her PhD, which was completed here at the Courtauld, which is when I first met Alice back in the day in the late 1990s. So, Alice, welcome back to the Courtauld.
Okay, the usual sound check, so hopefully everyone can hear me, and begin by thanking Professor Parkinson, Gavin, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series which celebrates, commemorates, but also questions the idea of 100 years of surrealism. As he mentioned, my talk is focused on Dorothea Tanning and draws very much on my curatorial work, as well as a book I have coming out in the spring, Dorothea Tanning, A Surrealist World, with Yale University Press. At the same time, because of the brief we got for the lecture series, I'm drawing on a few surrealist ideas or concepts, which hopefully will resonate with other lectures you've heard to date, and more to come, as we're seeing sort of progressing, I understand, across decades a little bit. So, for my purposes, as you can see, one of the key works I'm going to be talking about is this work called Hôtel du Pavot, Chambre Descendue, so Poppy Hotel Room 202, which was done between 1970 and 73. And automatically those are dates that people usually pounce on and say, well, surrealism was dead, surrealism was over. Hopefully we're past the canonical idea that surrealism died with World War II. Certainly our generation of researchers and graduates of the Courtauld, I think it's fair to say, have been very much emphasizing the need to look at post-war 50s, 60s, and 70s surrealism too. And of course, if you're interested in more global surrealism, if you're interested in women artists, then again, there's a really profound need to remap the terrain of surrealism, but also to look at the long history of the movement, way beyond the interwar classical period and beyond the death of André Breton too. So, as I say, I'm looking at Dorothea Tanning closely and the idea of her mapping, her creating a surrealist world. So in the mid-1960s, the American Surrealist Dorothea Tanning turned from the painted canvas to to the sewing machine. She crafted thrift shop textiles, sheep's wool, and found objects, domestic objects, as Gavin mentioned, into soft sculptures. With the help of everyday things such as stuffing, tweed, fun fur, ping pong balls, and jigsaw pieces, she mobilized banal materials and domestic objects into surrealist and emphatically fetishistic ones. A seamstress pincushion becomes a dark velvet symbol of metamorphosis and desire in Pincushion to serve as fetish, the title she gives it, of 1965, whereas you see velvet, paint, pins, a plastic funnel, sawdust, and lead gun pellets were mobilized into a fetish form. For the artist, its pins were as crucial to its bulbous form as the color of the velvet. Both emphasize what lies beneath the skin, drawing the eye to the pink-orange orifice to one side. Also, in its first staging in Paris in 1974, the public were invited to insert pins from a box on the floor beside it, as entwined in Rainy Day Canape of 1970, as inside and outside, seams and stuffing, support and limbs fused to emphasize interpenetration and the sensation of touch, the sense that the surrealist privileged above all others. And the work we're going to focus on, a large Alice in Wonderland-like installation titled Poppy Hotel, Room 202, from 1970 to 1973, was crafted across 3 years in parts to become a whole. A work she described as perhaps her most surrealist work in correspondence in the 1970s, ensured the surrealist object of the 1930s, which is perhaps better known to us, advanced to a much more immersive, confident, if not screaming surrealist installation by the 1930s. Advancing the classical surrealist object in scale and subversive potential might also be seen to comment on the continued relevance of surrealism, as mentioned, to the 60s and after it, a period of contemporary market vogue for conceptual hard-edge minimalism of the period. Tanning spoke of her sculptures as, quote, living materials, becoming live and living sculptures, their lifespan something like ours, the quote which I borrowed from the title. In my book, Dorothea Tanning, A Surrealist World, I show how she offers an eco-poetic surrealism in which the artwork enacts a surrealist worldview best understood as an ambition to understand nature through ourselves and not ourselves through nature. This is the sense of living that André Breton articulates in his use of the word living in the essay of 1953 on surrealism and its living works. I think it's critical to our sense of the collective work of surrealism, especially in the aftermath of World War II, but also the need to ensure that we balance male and female contributions to that collective to ensure we have a fully of the language as well as the artwork and the shared ambitions. So in my book, I explore quite a lot about the idea of world making and landscapes. So it's not, if you like, it can be the body in landscape. And with the color green sort of permeates across chapters. I document in 5 chapters each of the actual landscapes within which she lived, moving from Galesburg, Illinois, to Chicago, to New York, to Sedona, Arizona, to Paris, to Seyon and Provence down the end, and back to New York where she dies. So it's a journey across each of the landscapes in which she lived and exploring the theme of the landscape as produced in her paintings and by the time of chapter 5, her soft sculptures. And I think it's important again for us to do due diligence, if you like, to the narrative of Tanning, because she's not an artist that is being rediscovered within the language, if you like, of discovery to that extent. She was always active, she was always exhibiting, she was involved in collective exhibitions, including the major 1947 and 1959 international surrealist exhibitions in Paris. And as you see from photographs here, which are sort of plucked from the book, it's where she again goes from a kind of small town and it begins to advance herself in the 1940s between New York and Sedona, Arizona, across to her actually then living in the countryside in that checked shirt, which sort of sets her up in the West, I write about them making their cabin house and the idea of living in the Western landscape, American landscape, alongside Hoppy Messas. And through to her in Paris, this is a gorgeous photo by Lee Miller of her. Then this is her on the hillside where her final house with Max Ernst was. This is from about 1970 in Sayon, down in Provence, through to, as I say, her in her apartment in New York at the end of her life. She lived a long life to 101, and I always remind students that surrealism is very, very good for your health. So what we find with Dorothea Tanning is that when it comes to these ideas around touch, the object, the sensual as well as the sensuous, she expanded a lot of those ideas into what is literally, again, as Gavin mentioned, in the Centre Pompidou exhibition of surrealism at the moment, a room-size installation. And with this work, we find, if you like, lots of themes of surrealism coming to the fore. Thankfully, the work of women surrealists in the show in Paris doesn't ghettoize women. Again, we wouldn't expect it, but it can happen. So it's rightfully so. They're immersed within collective themes and ambitions, and indeed this work is included in Political Monsters, which I was delighted to see. At the same time, the socio-political aspirations and statements and collective statements of surrealism and their shared ideas of activating art as a work of resistance can be lost within that exhibition. I don't know whether you've gone to see it yet, it's on until January, but you'll find that one of the ways of sort of pacing the political narrative is the use of actual declarations, manifestos on the wall. So every room has one as a sort of a point of contact so that you can check an original document, trying to remind us again of the fact that the surrealists are always issuing manifestos, tracts, ensuring there's a collective momentum, irrespective of the great diversity across the artworks in it. But I'm taking this invitation from Gavin to present my research to again draw out the humanist and proto-feminist resistance that work in Tanning sculpture, lest they get subsumed within any more generalist, broad-brush narrative, or indeed a woman artist dialogue alone. For the exhibition, I wrote on Eros for the catalogue for the Pompidou show, and this is what I was mentioning to Gavin, and it's a warning to all of you who are doing PhDs that your PhD work fabulously follows you. And I thank Sarah Wilson, Professor Wilson in the front row, who supervised and mentored that PhD, and obviously has been in touch since. But there is the idea that we're still reworking a lot of these concepts around surrealism. It's important to emphasize again the idea of the living, which I mentioned that Breton articulates, comes from a sense of the life drive, which is how we define Eros, as opposed to Thanatos, the death drive. Eros surrealism wasn't just born out of one world war, but as you know, it battled and survived World War II, the Algerian War, the Vietnam War, the Watts riots, the events of May '68, and onwards. So we sense always that we need to keep in mind the wider frame of the politics of Eros as a counter-narrative, a counterculture to an institutionalized society, which is actually privileging to this day, as well as then the death drive, like Thanatos. And there's a kind of subtle dialogue the whole time between something that is erotic and playful and life-driving in that sense, versus the fact that it's used to resist Thanatos, the death drive, the warring drive, and the more masculine drive, that is perhaps more acceptable. But how does this manifest itself in sculpture? Well, when Dorothea Tanning talked of her art, she described it in terms which alluded to the social frame, but also in a covert or clandestine way. And again, that's important because obviously the surrealists were emphatic that they didn't want to be Stalinist. They didn't want to be dictating, giving you one reading, one answer, one text. There's that sense of open labyrinthine meaning, which very much engages you. She stated that she aimed to produce not an image, and this is the quote you see, but an image bristling with images. Now, bristling demands that the viewer engage, imagines, or associates. Or in other sort of Duchampian way, we might say the viewer completes the work of art. Surrealism, as you know, offers a map or a recipe for resistance, not a set of rational orders. And certainly from the first Surrealist manifesto, that's emphatically clear, if only in the dots that occur within the text, the pauses, the break it, the play with language, which ensures that it's not linear, it's not whole. The idea of bristling is an idea that I use again in the book to emphasize how it might be understood as standing upright or away from the surface, in anger, in fear, or in excitement. And that's the definition of the verb, if you like, of bristling from the dictionary. It also reflects the performative praxis of surrealism, I suggest. Tanning spoke a lot about her work and gave us 2 memoirs, and that's fabulous because we have a sort of self-fashioning voice going through her career. She also kept religiously a journal, and I've had the great privilege to work through those journals at the Tanning Foundation in New York with the help of Pam Johnson, the archivist there, as well as permission of Mimi Johnson, the niece of Dorothea Tanning. And so she's someone who, again, we have to sort of dialogue with through the published, the unpublished word in that sense. And I think her language is very telling and certainly adds layers and layers to how we appreciate her work and its surrealist activism. In a 1976 interview with Monique Levi-Strauss, Tanning explained her sculptures in corporeal terms. She spoke of a master-slave-like dynamic in the push and pull of cloth, and here I've obviously highlighted some words within the quote for you to look at. She explained, "I've always been excited by a piece of woven cloth. Something ancient and sensuous rises in me to greet and touch and manipulate this first of man's refinements, first of his inventions not devoted to survival. If there is such a thing as a felicitous relation, master-slave, well, it's the certainty that a cloth will bend to your will, that it will take the form that you have in your imagination destined it to take." On discussing her soft sculptures, Tanning thus emphasized their physicality, but also their anthropomorphic nature, reminding us of the surrealist long-standing interest in the uncanny potential of materiality. Her soft sculptures were born in 1965, so late in her career. She continued to produce them through to the late 1970s. And it's without a doubt that it's actually the studio space, as we often find with artists, was in a new house in Sayon, Provence, where she could literally take the sheep's wool from the fields around with Max Ernst, that she could expand a lot of her earlier ideas into something, as I say, of a room-size scale. And here I give you photographs of Max Ernst and Dorothea Tanning across their career. They married in 1946, they met in 1942, they began a relationship in 1943 when he was married to Peggy Guggenheim at the time. This is fantastic. Again, I seem to be I was always lured by the green across my sort of study of Tanning for the book at least. And this is again a fabulous photo of her by Lee Miller when she and Roland Penrose visited them, Max Ernst and Dorothea, in Arizona in 1946. That's Max at the bottom, photographed by Warhol in 1975. He dies the following year. But it's also important to look at the fact that we have Warhol, Lee Miller, Irving Penn. We have man-raging photographs of them. We have a whole circle of intellectuals and artists the whole time around Dorothea Tanning as well. And she was very much not working, therefore, in any form of isolation, no matter what landscape she was living in. There was non-stop flow of visitors to every home she was in. By the time we had these soft sculptures emerging in the 1960s and 70s, Dorothea Tanning was obviously well established. She was someone who had been exhibiting with the Surrealists as well as in solo exhibitions, notably with the Eolus Gallery in Paris. But it's again important to note in terms of the history of Surrealism that she was part of the first wave of women to join the movement. They begin around 1936 for the movement, and she was one of those 31 women who were exhibited in Peggy Guggenheim's groundbreaking exhibition, 31 Women. That show included Merritt Oppenheim, whose object, Luncheon and Fur, of 1936, had rocked Tanning over her heels, is what she writes in her memoirs, when she saw it first in New York at the MoMA for Alfred Barr's exhibition, Fantastic Art Data, Surrealism, which you see here. So in 1936, you have a young Dorothea Tanning coming to New York and discovering surrealism and saying it just rocked her over her heels in 1936. And by 1943, she's exhibiting as a surrealist with the surrealists. And this is a very, so she's a very ambitious artist working in New York, mixing and meeting, looking at art closely and fashioning her own style. When she turns to sculpture years later, without a doubt, she's thinking back through some of these sort of now canonical works of art and works that are done by women. Max Ernst's sculptures in this show, so had Joseph Cornell, but I think also Mary Oppenheim was obviously something that really had a strong impact on her at the time. She explained that when it came to her deciding to actually take on the challenge of doing soft sculptures, that it was a challenge to herself, if you like. So she said it was a bet that I made with myself and only me, that I would give real physical life to a bunch of tweeds and stuffing. Now, when you look at it, it's triumphant, never say that word, paroxysmic, despairing physicality. You're not quite sure that materials are only tools, that the inert is the inert, that life is something else. Now, she said this in 2001, towards the end of her career, again, for a small, it's a flyer really, it's where it's quoted in a Philadelphia Museum catalogue, Birthday, which marked their acquisition of her painting of that name that we'll see shortly. But again, I think it's interesting to think about how she talks about the process and emphasizes that tweeds and stuffing, these living materials that she to grapple, squash, sew together and work with, quite different from a data found object in that way. She wanted to render the inert material fabulously alert, to sustain its life qualities, if you like, to ensure that fabrics and stuffing went beyond the rank of tools, and to gesture to the spectator. There's a lot of language around this idea of gesturing, reaching out, pulling in, which I think, again, reinforces a new direction for surrealism in the aftermath of World War II. It moves away or complicates, certainly, the surrealist strategy of bizarre juxtaposition and their rendering of the functional dysfunctional that we associate with surrealist objects, whether it's china being married to fur, lobsters being married to telephones, or irons being decorated with tacks, which of course always makes their function dysfunctional in the sense that man-raised iron here would obviously rip any cloth it came in contact with. Again, it means that it forces us, as always with surrealism, to think through the difference between hardness and softness, something that's animalistic and something that's man-made. But I think it shows that she's sort of continuing this ambition of the surrealist sculpture object and returning to it emphatically in the 60s and 70s at a time when the art market and art world was witnessing a profound turn to sculpture too. Tanning's sculpture Verb, again, fabulous work, which is in the Yale Center collection, exemplifies her haptic play. And again, this idea that there's a kind of a dialogue that goes on the whole time. There's work that has to be done in terms of the spectator's engagement with what you're seeing. Your eye is drawn to the visible seams between the exterior and the interior of the sculpture. And this is something quite profound, and having worked up close with conservationists in the unboxing and display of these works, really the sewing, there's a crudity about a certain amount of the sewing that comes with the cloth and problems around moths and aging and everything, of course. But actually there's an emphatic visibility, so it's not in any way seamless. You see all the stitch, the work, the time in that sense, in a kind of amateur way. So you see those sort of sense, which makes you think a little bit more, I feel, about the interior and exterior, the whole process involved. And we note not only this sort of bizarre, gaping Sesame Street-like mouth, but also this awkward dotting with teeth, which again, when it was in a vitrine in the both exhibitions, it's great because we could make sure people could walk all around and the lighting was such. And you see it is indeed made up of teeth made from jigsaw puzzle on closer inspection, and as the heading reveals already. we find that these are pieces from a puzzle depicting Johann Vermeer's The Art of Painting from the 17th century. So while the neck of this trophy head seems to end in a very cute sort of little cat-like paw, which you note here, we found the gaping mouth is devouring, again, a very canonical piece of Western art by a male that demands us to delve further into what's going on. Now, according to interviews I've held with her niece, Mimi Johnson, Tanning often had jigsaw puzzles. And I think Mimi Johnson said something like, well, we always had jigsaw puzzles. You know, Provence, down south, you had jigsaw puzzles in that kind of sense, so it might have been typical. But knowing Tanning in terms of her note-taking, her attention to detail, and her sort of her cleverness, really, in so many ways, it's obvious this is a further layer of meaning. It goes beyond just a found object of a jigsaw, it's a found object of a Vermeer jigsaw. And again, I'm sure many people here can speak more articulately about Vermeer than I. At the same time, when we think about this work, it's a comment on a canonical work, which of course is an allegory for the artist at work, full stop, as a painting. So we usually interpret Vermeer's work. We see Vermeer mastering the genres of portraiture, landscape, and still life painting on the canvas through details and association. And I think Tanning is doing a one-up man in that sense, in terms of her doing it all that plus more. In the work, the model is the muse of history, Clio, as symbolized by the trumpet, the book, the laurel wreath. The large map on the wall depicts the Netherlands. The still life on the table includes a book of treatises on painting, a sculpting study, or a mask, and a sketchbook. So you have all the paraphernalia of the studio work, of the academic training, as well as the gendering of the mastery through the muse, Clio. Tanning literally breaks up this composition to create a monstrous form. The restrained Clio is now a screeching one, and a base open mouth without eyes or ears or limbs. She's down to literally this orifice, this scream. And the title, which is a verb, again, is a word which reinforces the aesthetic underpinning it. It's a word which denotes how we give action. We assert something. That is what verb means. Now, Tanning stated she wanted to show that life is something else when it came to soft sculptures, and when it came specifically to this idea of being immersed or confronted with a hotel room size space. And when it comes to this work, Poppy Hotel, room 202, we find, as you can see, a three-walled installation. So you walk in, it has three walls, with a half-open door, just ajar, which you can see here. So again, this is the jar. So you have a rope here normally when you're exhibiting it. And again, I'm not sure how many people have seen this when it has been exhibited to date or currently in Paris. But you'll note 202 is written here on the door. It's a jar with it does have a handle such that it looks like one could push or pull. The suggestion, the trompe-l'oeil, is that you feel there's something around or behind. And there's also this gorgeous detail, which is this little flicker of a hand, just two fingers, that again, in terms of having spent 4 days it took, I think, the first time to install this in the Reina Sofia, with a person who was allowed to do it from the Pompidou as well as the whole team. Again, those little details in terms of the actual set of instructions and making sure that there's enough to suggest something more, but not enough to be able to see the fact that this is just a mise en scène is critical to the instructions in terms of correspondence and its installation. But there are these little details that hint at more, as I say, that woo the eye in many different directions, and that pull you into what she described in an unpublished journal as a destitute hotel room, anonymous, everywhere, nowhere. So it doesn't only, it's not only on show in the Beaubourg at the moment, but it's in part of the permanent collection, and was bought early on, which was a fabulous coup, although not exhibited for many decades, unfortunately. But as I say, it does have very clear instructions in terms of the work. And she explained that she wanted it to appear as if, and I quote her, the wallpaper will further tear with screams. So we have this language of screams. And yet, for an old banality, again her words, to hover over the scene. So accordingly, we have a chimney, which you can see there, birthing works out here, half human, half animal, and they recall therefore, as you see here, Alice's adventures in Wonderland, in which we read that Alice's sipping of the magic potion turns her from tiny to huge, growing and growing so that she dwarfs the domestic space. And there's a lot of play therefore with scale and bursting the seams of the domestic in that sense. So we have the sense that Alice, as I said, is dwarfing the domestic scene in the original tale, in the illustrations, and Lewis Carroll writes of a tidy little room with a table and a window. The physical constraints of this room are such that Alice explains, or we read about Alice, that as a last resource, quote, she put one arm out of the window, 1 foot up the chimney, and said to herself, now, can I do no more? Whatever happens, what will become of me? So this is the photo, again, from images from which the Surrealists were fabulously aware of. A whole visual vocabulary on which they could draw, tropes which obviously they were playing with in many different media, and which Tanning, without a doubt, was specifically referencing in this room scale work. Now Alice, as I mentioned, was very popular, very beloved by many of the Surrealists, notably in the earlier period, but also very much of interest to her husband, Max Ernst. And as Sarah Wilson notes in a 1989 catalogue essay on Dorothea Tanning's works on paper, which was on in London in 1989, the aspiring Tanning likely saw Max Ernst's numerous paintings of Alice, understood mainly to be an homage to his lost love Leonora Carrington at this moment. We also know that the aforementioned fantastic Art Dada Surrealism exhibition that Alfred Barr curated included original drawings of Alice in Wonderland. So we have this shift. There's no linearity when it comes to time in Surrealism. It's a moving back and forward. And in her oeuvre, Tanning therefore makes the meticulous detail, the curious young female, the vertiginous architecture, all the details of Carroll's Alice in Wonderland her own. In the Hotel du Pavot, I suggest what she does is push them from a femme enfant, a young girl phenomenon that she herself very much indulged in the 1940s, as you see in Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a little night music from the Tate collection, where again you will note a series of numbers on doors which suggest this is a hotel or a public space, where the colour is all important, and where she explained the sunflower again as perhaps not something that's threatening these young girls, as this work is often read in sort of negative terms, but actually as a sign of courage, a sign of something more, and that vibrant palette again suggests something more is afoot. When it comes to Hotel du Pavot, I think what happens is those girls have become adults. They're wreaking havoc on an interior in their Wonderland-like metamorphosis, as if we've come face to face with Alice, all grown up. And I always think about that what she's doing is, if you think about the story of Alice in Wonderland, we always have this sort of final awakening, the return to the rational, the return to the older sister who's reading a book without images, the tale of Alice. But what we have with particularly a lot of women surrealists' pursuit of Alice is saying, what if that didn't happen? What if she stayed running after the rabbit? What if she did something else? And I think there's an explosion of kind of some of the potential of the Alice story, a ... that certainly Tanning plays with. So we find here, as I say, we have the chimney breast there, spouting out forms that are animalistic, pig-like, but then there's little sort of, the trotters are also feminine, like legs. We have two voluptuous forms, headless, importantly, bodies, crafted in pink wool fabric that she described in her journal as the odalisque colour of flesh that burst through in and out of the drab wallpaper. And as you can see, there's a soft belly and buttocks which ensure the motion in and out of the man-made environment is constantly threatened. There's an emphatic acephalic headlessness going on, prevailing in the work. Now, Surrealist students here will also be familiar with the idea of the femme sans tête, the headless woman, exemplified by Max Ernst in a collage book of the same name of 1929. And so I think there's a proto-feminist claim on a lot, again, of these sort of the iconography of Surrealism, the earlier classical tradition that she yields and makes her own. So where the headless female in male surrealist art often denotes or reinforces woman's innate association with the body, with nature, with the senses, with the lack of control, and of course her proclivity for hysteria. Here we have an emphatic feminine corporality in form, in palette, all importantly, and in material that lauds over, that celebrates formlessness in all its feminine powers. So we have the idea of her mocking the femme fatale, as I say, magnifying the power or the attraction of the femme enfant, and claiming it for her own. She described these, again, her sort of own descriptions allow us to sort of poetically think a bit more about what they're trying to do, but she described them in a journal as a tangled group of flesh and fur that clung together from the start. So she's personifying them fabulously in all her own notes as she's building up this project. Now, the inexpensive dark flower wallpaper she described as an old wallpaper we found in some little village when Alfred Pachmann, the director of the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, contacted her about them installing it for a show in 2008, 2009, asking about the wallpaper and any specifics. So she said, we found it in some little village. The hard floor, the fake paneling, the pictureless walls, as well as this sort of drab, dreary wallpaper, and the attention to this naked light bulb, which has to be this rather, another photo, has to be this rather awful light bulb, which is very hard to get nowadays, actually. All stand in contrast then to the pulsating limbs. But as I say, down to the little rug, which was stolen the first time it was exhibited, which is refound. These are all the wonderful quirks and turns of when you actually get to unbox and install things. And to make the wallpaper so drab, in keeping with the artist's intention, which is something that one might discuss in terms of the whole ethics of curating. But again, what's often used is tea to stain it, to give it that exhausted drab quality. So in any case, the domestic tableau, a comparison again to sort of make us think about this moment for art history and for the 60s and for sculpture. The tableau might make one think of Edward Kienholz's work, such as The Weight, which you see here in front of you, where memories shroud an elderly woman, literally shrouding her. Her necklace made from canning jars, her face a cruel reminder of the young woman she once was. The pink forms of Hans Bellmer's Poupée. I've often also, when I've sort of presented Tanning's work, people have sort of mentioned maybe there's a Bellmer play, and I think yes, undoubtedly they are. Although, as we know, Bellmer produced a doll which he photographed, and his 50s and 60s sculptures were very hard memorial. They're emphatically hard as opposed to soft and luscious like hers. In the book, I also look into Louise Bourgeois' sculptures, bringing them into play too, mindful that there are many subversive cuttings and stitchings in surrealism and its circle and its heirs, especially by the decade of the 60s and 70s. But I think when it comes to Tanning's use of old materials and making them sort of newly born in this room, we also need to think about other, as I say, references that move back and forth across a very particular surrealist iconography. And that's again one of the reasons I insist that her work continues to be and must be framed within a surrealist world making. It is not a change out of surrealism. She doesn't abandon surrealism once she abandons the hard-edge illusionism you saw with Eine kleine Nachtmusik. If anything, she advances surrealism in new directions, as so many were doing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So in other details of this Hotel du Pavot, we have the a revelation or the end of the month, as well as tragic table, which you see here pulled out in front of you. And in both of these works, again, we think of how the female character, the female form, is staged. These reference back the state of ecstasy, or amour passionnel, as romanticized by the surrealists in 1928, when they celebrated, documented 50 years of the 50th anniversary of hysteria in La Révolution Surréaliste, their journal. And we also have the idea of her dialoguing with the fact that male surrealists emphatically embodied hysteria in erotically aroused females. This was the excuse, the grand narrative within which to show that arch female form, whether it was Henry Fuseli's Gothic iconography, which you see here in The Nightmare, or Alberto Giacometti's Woman with a Throat Cut of 1932, where the tension between seduction and strangulation is what most disturbs the viewer, but again in bronze. There's no clinical nor final gaze at work with Tanning, rather reveling in jouissance and through this emphatic use of the soft. Her choice of cloth also augments, I think, this sense of play, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. You've got a woman who's in her 60s playing with a lot of these young men ideas, playing with what she's, with a history and making it her own in that sense. And I also like to think about the point that Whitney Chadwick makes in her canonical Women Artists in the Surrealist Movement book of 1985, that one of the problems with the men and their approach to women was that the men insisted on donning three-piece tweed suits. And so there's that sense that they're always sort of booted and tied with the men, and there's, I think, an element coming out there. At the same time, tweed was emerging as a trend in women's fashion by 1970. Mary Quant, Vivienne Westwood were subverting the classical, patriarchal and emphatically male use of tweed in their use of it for sexy miniskirts, for the punk attire of the Sex Pistols. And Tanning always favoured thrift and vintage clothes, recycling or upcycling fashions past, and salvaging memories that the fabrics might hold. She emphasised a lot about fashion being la mode and new fashion being à la mode, and that she was pulled more towards the old and what it might hold within the garment. This idea that they spoke to her garments was important. That also tallies with the fact that Tanning's early career began in consumer culture. It began in fashion. It began she began working as a freelance illustrator, producing designs for Macy's New York, selling dreams through perfume, pearl necklaces, handbags, hats. And these are just some from the archive in New York, but again you see the sort of the early seeds of some of surrealism at work for advertising, where the tree, the sort of femme arab is morphing into limbs and hats, and also where you have everything constantly moving in her advertising that she was doing for Macy's to pay the rent. In her first autobiography, Birthday, she also writes about the challenges of living as a modern woman in New York, living in a busy city, fashioning herself, not having an income there. She talks about scavenging for bargains in places like Klein's, a cut-rate clothing store on New York's Union Square. She also writes about the clothing that she might have discovered in very haptic terms. She talks about women grabbing objects of their choice, disrobing and trying them on, and then how, after putting your few dollars into this purchase, she said, at nightfall, then these $5 rags will be transformed into rainbow. Hours later, having served its purpose, it will be dropped on the floor like a shed skin, as a new time, new span begins. So we find her documenting vignettes around clothing and cloth, and the story of her youth in New York, as well as through to, as I say, when she talks about the fleshy colours she was determined to include in her soft sculptures. And here we have Birthday of 1942, which gestures to fabrics too. This is the work that got her included in VVV in New York, that was included in the aforementioned Guggenheim's 31 Women show in New York. And it is the work which sort of marked her birth as a surrealist. She also writes, though, about this self-portrait, again, in architectural spatial terms. She talks about the fact that when she met Max Ernst, it was unfinished. In the December of 1942, he suggested the name Birthday. It wasn't to mark her actual day of birth, but obviously it was a suggestion of a birth, a relationship with surrealism as well as him that was about to happen, he hoped, and that did. And when she talks about, as I say, that dynamic, she does so in these similar terms. I was his house, he lived in me, he decorated me, he watched over me. If he ventured out of me, he knew he had not to lock the door. By the time we're talking about these soft sculptures, she is living in a house that she built herself, she designed herself. They began in a house that they called the Dolce Vita, down in Seyon. They moved there in 1965-66. This is the photo I took of it in 2017. It's had an extension here, but this was the one in the heart, really, of the village that she and Max Ernst lived, and where, when her American nieces, Mimi and Martha Johnson, visited, and where they were wallpapering one of the front rooms in this work they called La Dolce Vita, they were playing again with this idea of camouflage and wallpaper and something flesh and inert morphing together. This is in 1966, and we're not having, as I say, that Hotel du Pavot for another few years, but you can see her playing with this in real life as well as advancing her ideas. This is the house she ended up in, which she ensured had a fabulous downstairs studio for the elderly Max Ernst, now called the Masson Roque, down in Seyon, and where she also had a gorgeous studio, as well as an American kitchen and bathrooms, etc. And the pièce de résistance is the keyhole-shaped swimming pool, which she also designed. Very American in many ways, but they're still in Seyon. So all these things are coming together to try and sort of see how she's shaping, as I say, her own life, her own identity through details, and how the life and the art cannot be divorced in any shape or form. Her body of sculptures were many, and actually one of the fun parts was for the curating work was to bring them out of boxes and together, because I think only the Tate's nude sculpture was one of the few that was actually on display. For many museums, they were kept boxed away, and because there was a huge concern around their fragility, to be fair as well. But of course, I can't not mention the Eros show, because this is also something I think we need to keep in mind when we look at her later works, and specifically her turn to the soft, to the sculptural. Because the 1959 International Surrealist Show in Paris at the Galerie Daniel Cordier, dedicated to Eros, was all about velvet, was all about orgasmic sighs, literally being pumped through the room, so that you heard these recordings, the perfume flattery being sprayed in the air. There was intriguing cavernous walls, as you can see here. There was a fetish crypt, and it was a work or a show in which Dorothea Tanning was also involved, even though it's not often noted. She included interior with sudden joy. The better known artist involved is Merit Oppenheim, she of Object, Luncheon and Fur, who exhibited Festin on a live female in the Hommage de Marquis de Sade in the Eros show. So we have an erotisme noir and a really profound movement forward of women, I would say, as there's a turn to Eros and sculpture and installation from the 59 show on as well. Now, you'll be glad to know that I'm coming to an end, because two other small points might be made, and one is that Tanning emphasized that Eros was something that was open. In fact, when she writes about Eros, she's nervous about feminists over-reading the element of Eros, which, as you can imagine, was profoundly funny or concerning for me as someone who specialized in Eros. But she did also note that often our approach to Eros falls to the spectator. She said, who is more hung up here when you're talking about Eros? When you approach it and theorize it, does it reflect your concern, your prudery, or is it something that's more playful? And I think it shows her using even the word Eros in her memoirs, shows that she was thinking in those terms in advance of feminists in any way coining it. She also said that she was inspired by music, the sensorial, the performative, notably Karl Heinz Stockhausen's Hymnen, which she heard at the Maison de la Radio in Paris in 1969. Again, Stockhausen's piece is an electronic concrete music piece, which is loud, jarring noise, national anthems in the mix, a little girl laughing, there's the Marseillaise being played, and then you have a goose honking. So it's a total cacophony of sounds, but the anthems, national anthems, are in the mix, being overcome by the noise of the everyday. Which means that while people often talk about the influence of hymn and music, the actual further detail of the fact that that music, and Stockhausen in particular, a work from 1966-67 that she heard in 69, after the events of 68, resonate powerfully with a much more political resistance, again, that often is just removed from how we approach Dorothea Tanning, and I would say often because she's female, that sort of wider frame got lost. She mentioned in an interview in 2005 with the Surrealist scholar Victoria Carruthers how again there was a song she was referencing, a popular song about Kitty Kane, a Chicago gangster wife who poisoned herself in room 202 of a local hotel. This is one from the turn of the century that she'd heard in Chicago as a young woman working there. And in the words of that song, we do find, again, the suggestion of death, of destruction in room 202. And the quote that Carruthers notes is that it says in the song, "Shall I tell everything they said, or put out the light and go to bed? In room 202, the walls keep talking to you." But again, if you look at the song in sort of more detail, we find actually that there are more tropes in the mix which show the sort of magpie as well as the constant building up of ideas that was at work in Dorothy Tanning's oeuvre, because the final fifth verse of that song also talks about a fellow drank so much one night, you'll be glad I'm not singing it, a fellow drank so much one night he got the shakes, he was a million different kinds of wriggling snakes. While walking in his sleep, he found an open door. That's the bit I like, obviously. Next day, he told the judge he'd like to see some more. So it's the open door motif that ends that song that actually, again, resonates powerfully. With the Hotel du Pavot, we have details, we have association, we have the incidental. They're all bristling, rather than us sort of thinking about the whole. And it depends where your eye, your mind, your association, your songs, your literary reference, etc. lead you. Walter Benjamin, in The Last Snapshot of European Intelligentsia, his essay of 1929, emphasized that one of the most politically potential aspects of surrealism was the fact that it was looking at objects which had just become extinct at close of 5 years ago, and the outmoded. So he brings a lot of that idea of the past decay to come into play and says this is where European intelligentsia might lie. Obviously there are references to literature I can't go into, to Gothic novels. Charlotte Perkin Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper resonates with a lot of this work, as does Charles Baudelaire's, again a poet much beloved by the Surrealists and quoted in the first manifesto, and his poem Le Chant Double of 1862, in which Baudelaire writes of a room odorous with regret and desire, low, languishing. He also talks about the fact that in this room there are no artistic abominations. That leads me to my very final point, which is that when you see her building up a lot of these gorgeous drawings, thinking through how she's going to, some are more explicit than others, whether it be frontal or back, bulging in or out of the room. This is also to show you how where some wallpapers have worked terribly badly for Dorothea Tanning, and where again it is down to certain challenges of curating, but it does still remind you how a lot of it is about the lighting and the shading and making sure that there's a whole sort of mise en scène that's very powerful and in keeping with her sense of what this was meant to do. And it brings me to the last point about Tanning's soft sculptures, which is the idea that they don't just immerse you theatrically in a surrealist space or phenomenological experience, but invite you to be fellow traveller. And this is very much the idea that I tried to pull out in my book, this sense that we are there we are being lured, invited, if not caught. She used the metaphor of the web a lot for her work, but being caught in a surrealist moment, from which she said there should be no exit. So that sense that there's a tension between the materiality of these and our sense of our own material selves as we're there. So whether you feel, if you like, a sense of eroticism or despair, and she said that her sculpture stood in for this human dilemma within which we all stand between eroticism and despair, we have a sense that the door is ajar, that we're there. And this is most evident in, again, perhaps one of the details that doesn't always isn't always visible or isn't always discussed, which is the fact that actually at the back of the Hotel du Pavot, which is why you have to have this awful bulb, this really sort of crude bulb, in the sense that we can't buy them anymore, which, as you can see, maps an empty painting. And because there's an empty painting, when it comes to you as a viewer, you have a sense of being both sides of the frame, both sides of the mirror. Again, a concept she was very excited about. She said her early works were going through the mirror, whereas her late works were the other side of the mirror. And the missing painting reinforces this web-like nature of our surrealism, mobilizing you, as I say, on both sides, to emphasize that we are part of the work. We are activating the work. Through materials and softness and the ludic and playful. I do think it's really important to think about the playful and the sort of jouissance of eros going on in her work too. She emphasized that art, and particularly sculpture, is not to be decorative. It's not to be a decorative cipher without life or meaning, but is, as I say, a means for praxis, for making a surrealist collective worldview. Thank you.